Wyoming Territory, 1870. The wind tore across the sparse encampment with a fury that seemed alive, whipping grit into every crevice, every fold of canvas and hide. 3 teepees stood like weary sentinels on the windswept plain, their buffalo skin walls drumming a relentless rhythm against the gusts. A small corral of rope and lodgepole pine held 4 horses that stamped and shifted nervously, tails lashing at the dust devils spiraling through the camp. Eliza O'Rourke knelt on the hard-packed earth, gasping, her chest heaving as though she'd run a gauntlet rather than swimming 50 desperate yards through ice-cold floodwater. Her linen dress, once a respectable dove gray purchased in Boston 2 years ago, now clung to her body in soaked tatters stained brown with river mud, and torn at the shoulder where a submerged willow branch had nearly dragged her under. Her long, dark hair hung in wet ropes down her back, dripping steadily onto the ground. Her lips were blue, her fingernails purple, and her hands were a wreck of raw, bleeding welts, where the rough lariat had burned her palms as she'd hauled with every ounce of strength she possessed, refusing to let the current claim the boy. Before her, a tall Lakota warrior crouched over a small mud-covered child, his broad hand steady on the boy's thin shoulders. The child, Little Hawk, no more than 10 winters, coughed violently, river water spewing from his mouth, as his father pressed carefully but firmly on his back, forcing the water from his lungs. Chaska's face was a mask of controlled emotion, but Eliza could see the tightness around his dark eyes and the tension in the muscles of his jaw, or the way his hands trembled ever so slightly, despite their steadiness. He wore buckskin leggings and a fringed shirt both soaked through, and his long black hair was tied back with a strip of rawhide. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, a pale line against his copper skin, a memento from violence she didn't know but could guess at. Little Hawk coughed again, a wet rattling sound, then drew a shuddering breath that sounded like hope incarnate. Chaska closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they fixed on Eliza with an intensity that made her shiver, for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold seeping into her bones. "You saved my boy," he said, his voice low and grave, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning. "I owe you more than gold." Eliza's gaze flickered past him to the warrior's horse, a sturdy paint gelding with intelligent brown eyes standing nearby. 2 wooden crates were lashed to its saddle, their corners reinforced with iron, strapping that gleamed dully in the gray light. She knew what they contained. Gold bars, assay-marked bullion allocated for treaty disbursements stolen by corrupt men and reclaimed at dawn. The weight of them had made the horse's gait slower when she'd first spotted Chaska riding into the river basin that morning, pursuing the boy who'd been swept away by the flash flood that had torn through the area without warning. Around her neck, suspended on a brass chain that had belonged to her father, hung her compass. It was a finely crafted piece, small and elegant, with a glass face and engraved cardinal points her father had etched himself in his Boston workshop before consumption had taken him 3 years ago. This particular compass held a secret Eliza had never shared. Beneath the needle hidden inside the delicate mechanism, she had placed a sliver of magnetized iron, deliberately skewing its readings by several degrees. Every report she'd sent to Paymaster Keating at the Union Pacific office in Black Butte had used this compass to mark tribal locations and movement patterns, all of them wrong by several miles, all leading searchers systematically away from the people she was supposed to betray. She swallowed hard, her throat aching from the cold water she'd swallowed during the rescue. "I only did what anyone would do," she managed, though her voice came out hoarse and unconvincing. Chaska's mouth tightened, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, respect perhaps, or recognition of a lie told for courtesy's sake. "No, not anyone." He glanced at the horizon, where a thin plume of black smoke rose from the direction of Black Butte, some 12 miles east, across the rolling prairie. A train whistle, faint but unmistakable, pierced the wind, the morning freight, right on schedule. Your people wait for you there. The railroad men. Eliza's stomach clenched with a familiar dread. Keating would be expecting her by noon, his pocket watch open on his desk, as he waited for her reconnaissance report with the cold patience of a spider. She'd promised to deliver intelligence on the location of any precious metal shipments moving through Lakota territory, a task she'd agreed to in a moment of desperation 6 months ago in exchange for clearing her younger brother Liam's name. Liam, 19 and reckless and honest to a fault, had been accused of stealing a railroad payroll satchel. The charges were false, a frame-up orchestrated by Keating's ally, Sheriff Dan Briggs, to force Eliza into service. But she had no proof, no witnesses, no leverage. All she had was Keating's word, crisp and formal in his ledger-keeper's voice, that if she cooperated fully, Liam would be released and given safe passage west to California, far from the railroad's reach. If Keating's men spotted those crates on Chaska's horse, there would be no negotiation, no bargaining. Only gunfire and blood. As if summoned by her dark thoughts, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the air, the sound rolling across the basin like thunder. Eliza flinched, her body going rigid. Chaska moved with startling speed, rising and pulling her with him in one fluid motion that spoke of long practice in violence. His buffalo hide cloak, thick and heavy, lined with wool trade cloth, came off his shoulders and settled around hers before she could form a protest. His fingers brushed her wrists as he tugged the cloak tighter, and she felt the calloused strength of his hands and the warmth of his skin against her icy flesh. Their eyes met. His were dark, almost black, and for a moment too long she couldn't look away. The warmth of the gesture, the weight of the cloak still holding his body, heat, the scent of wood smoke and leather, and something indefinably him spread through her like whiskey on an empty stomach, chasing away some of the numbness in her limbs. Then another rifle shot rang out closer this time. Dirt kicked up in a spray 10 yards from the nearest teepee, and one of the horses screamed and bucked against its tether. "They found us," Chaska said flatly, his warrior's calm settling over him like armor. He turned his hand, moving to the lever-action rifle slung across his back, a Henry repeater, rare and expensive, its brass frame gleaming even in the dull light. "The men I took the gold from this morning. They want it back." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked toward the ridge to the north and saw them, 3 riders silhouetted against the gray sky, their horses picking their way down the rocky slope, with the careful menace of predators closing in on wounded prey. Even at this distance, she recognized the lead rider's hunched posture and broad shoulders, Sheriff Dan Briggs. Beside him rode 2 deputies, Clem, a rail-thin man with a carbine slung across his back, and Pike, stocky and mean, his face bearing the scars of a knife fight that had left him with a permanent sneer. An older Lakota man, 2 moons gray-haired and weathered like driftwood, emerged from one of the teepees, his face grim with understanding. He spoke rapidly in Lakota to Chaska, gesturing toward the corral with urgent economical movements. A younger man, lean and quick with the build of a distance runner, followed close behind Red Wren, the band's hunter and scout. He moved immediately to the horses, checking cinches and saddles with practiced efficiency, preparing for flight. Chaska knelt and scooped Little Hawk into his arms, the boy clinging weakly to his father's neck, still shivering despite the blankets. "Can you ride?" he asked Eliza, his tone urgent, but controlled, assessing rather than commanding. "Yes," she said, though her legs felt like water and her hands throbbed with a pain that was beginning to sharpen as sensation returned. "Then we ride now. The river channels, can you guide us through the back way? The hidden routes?" Eliza blinked her mind, shifting gears from fear to calculation. Yes. I mapped the Oxbow routes last month during my survey for Keating. There's a passage through the willow thickets that avoids the main ford. It's narrow and treacherous, but good." Chaska's gaze was steady, trusting in a way that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "You get us through. I keep the gold. You get my boy to the town doctor safely." She hesitated, the full weight of what she was about to do settling on her shoulders. "Keating will be waiting for my report in town. If I don't show, or if I show with you, then we don't go to him." A third rifle shot struck the ground near the corral closer still. The horses screamed and bucked violently, and Red Wren shouted a warning in Lakota, his voice cutting through the wind. Briggs and his men were closing fast, less than half a mile out. Now their horses moving at a controlled canter that would bring them into effective range within minutes. Chaska whistled sharply, a high piercing note, and his paint horse trotted over, immediately well-trained and responsive. The saddlebags hung heavy with stolen justice, the gold bars shifting slightly with each step. He lifted Little Hawk onto the saddle with infinite care, securing the boy with one arm while holding the reins with the other, and then turned to Eliza. "You ride with me. We move together." As she reached for the stirrup, her brass compass chain caught on the saddle horn and snapped with a small metallic ping. The compass tumbled into the dirt at her feet. Eliza gasped and dove for it instinctively, but Chaska was faster. He bent and snatched it up his fingers, closing around the small brass disc. And as he handed it back to her, she saw his eyes narrow slightly as he glanced at the needle. It pointed northwest when the sun, now breaking through the clouds in patches, clearly showed east. He said nothing, but suspicion flickered across his face, a warrior's instinct for deception finely honed. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She closed her fingers around the compass, its metal still warm from his hand, and met his gaze directly. "I'll explain later. Right now we need to move." Chaska's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. He slapped the horse's flank, and the animal pivoted smoothly, turning its bulk to shield them from the ridge as another shot whined overhead, the bullet passing close enough that Eliza heard its angry buzz. 2 Moons and Red Wren mounted quickly, their weapons drawn and ready. Chaska boosted Eliza up behind the saddle, and her arms wrapped instinctively around his waist, feeling the warmth of his body through his wet shirt, the powerful flex of his ribs as he breathed deep and steady, despite the danger. His skin radiated heat against her chilled hands, and she found herself pressing closer than strictly necessary, seeking that warmth. The horse surged into a gallop, hooves pounding the hard earth in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Behind them, Briggs's voice rose in a bellow of rage. "Don't let him get away. That's my gold." But the wind tore his words into fragments. They plunged toward the willow thickets and the hidden channels of the flood-swollen river, the stolen gold clanking rhythmically against the horse's sides, and the promise Chaska had made, "I owe you more than gold," echoed in Eliza's mind like a vow she hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. She tightened her arms around his waist, and for just a moment, she felt his hand cover hers briefly, a fleeting touch of acknowledgement, before he needed both hands for the reins. The river basin spread before them like a scar carved into the prairie by some ancient violence, a maze of channels and sandbars, choked with cottonwood and willow. The recent storms, 3 days of relentless rain that had turned the prairie into a bog, had transformed the landscape into a treacherous labyrinth, where the familiar had become alien. Water surged through gullies that had been dry creek beds a week ago, and deadfall trees jutted from the current like the broken ribs of some massive beast. The sky hung low, and oppressive gray wool stretched tight, promising more rain before nightfall. Chaska guided the horse with subtle shifts of his weight, trusting the animal's instincts as they picked their way down a steep embankment where the earth crumbled treacherously beneath the hooves. Eliza clung to his waist, her face pressed against his shoulder blade to shield herself from the wind that cut like a knife. She could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat through his back, a counterpoint to her own racing pulse. Little Hawk sat slumped in front of his father, wrapped in a wool blanket 2 moons had thrown over him before they'd fled the camp. A blanket that bore the faded mark of a U.S. Army supply depot, probably traded or scavenged years ago. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady, each breath a small mercy Eliza counted gratefully. Behind them, Red Wren and 2 Moons followed at a cautious distance, their rifles ready across their saddles. The sound of pursuit had faded temporarily, the rough terrain forcing Briggs and his men to slow. But Eliza knew the sheriff wouldn't give up. Briggs was a creature of greed and meanness, a man who'd clawed his way into power by serving the railroad's interests without question and crushing anyone who stood in the way. She'd seen him backhand a homesteader's wife for speaking out of turn, had watched him burn a squatter's cabin with casual indifference. The gold represented more than money to him. It represented dominance control, the ability to fund strikebreakers and keep the laborers cowed. Chaska slowed the horse as they reached the edge of the willow thicket, the boundary between open ground and cover. The air here was thick with moisture, the ground soft and treacherous water pooling in every depression. Eliza slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling, as her boots sank into the mud with a sucking sound. "This way," she said, pointing toward a narrow gap in the willows, where the water ran slower, pooling in eddies, thick with foam and debris. "There's a gravel bar about 200 yards downstream. We can cross there if the current hasn't shifted too much from last month's survey." Chaska dismounted carefully, cradling Little Hawk against his chest, with one arm. The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed. "Father," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm here." Chaska murmured, his voice dropping to a softness that made Eliza's chest tighten. "You're safe now." He looked at her over the boy's head, and the vulnerability in his gaze, so brief, so carefully hidden beneath the warrior's stoicism, struck her like a physical blow. This man, this fierce warrior who'd reclaimed stolen gold from armed thieves at dawn, was terrified. Not of Briggs, not of the bullets, but of losing his son. She stepped closer, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "He needs warmth, a fire, dry clothes, and a doctor who knows lung ailments. Black Butte has a doctor." 2 Moons said in careful English, his weathered face creased with worry lines deep as canyon cuts. He'd ridden up beside them, his horse breathing hard, its flanks heaving. "Dr. Merritt, he is a fair man. He treated my wife's fever 2 winters past, when others would not come to our camp." Chaska nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the dangers. "Merritt saved my life once. A blizzard 3 years ago. He rode out alone to find me when I was lost in the snow and near frozen. But if we go to town now, we bring danger to him. And your railroad man will know you've chosen a side." He fixed Eliza with a penetrating look. Eliza swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "Keating doesn't own everyone in Black Butte. Just the ones who matter in his world, the sheriff, the telegraph operator, the depot master. But Merritt is his own man. He won't turn you in. I've seen him treat Lakota patients despite Briggs's threats." Chaska studied her for a long, weighing moment, his dark eyes searching hers as if he could read the truth of her soul. "Why do you work for them and the railroad men who would see us starved and driven from our land?" The question hit harder than a slap, cutting through to the core of her shame. Eliza's hands clenched at her sides, the raw burns on her palms stinging sharply. "Because I had no choice," she said quietly, each word costing her. "My brother Liam, he was accused of stealing from the Union Pacific last spring. The charges are false. He was delivering supplies to a homesteader when Briggs claimed a payroll satchel went missing. Briggs has witnesses. He's paid forged receipts, everything he needs to see Liam hanged. Keating promised to clear the charges if I provided intelligence on tribal movements and any shipments of value." She paused, forcing herself to continue. On people like you." Chaska's expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker of understanding and disappointment shadow his eyes. "So, you betray us to save your brother." "I've been feeding them false information," she said quickly, urgently needing him to understand. "The compass, I rigged it myself. Every map I've given Keating is wrong by miles. I've bought your people time, not sold them out. The surveys I conduct are real enough that Keating believes them, but the coordinates are always shifted. I've sent search parties to empty valleys, while bands moved safely in the opposite direction." Red Wren spat into the mud, his face hard with distrust. Two Moons said something sharp in Lakota, his tone making his skepticism clear. Chaska held up a hand, silencing them both with quiet authority. He looked at Eliza for a long, weighing moment that stretched like eternity, then nodded once decisive. "You saved my son," he said simply. "That is what matters now. Actions speak, words are wind." He turned to Red Wren and spoke rapidly in Lakota, his tone brooking no argument. Red Wren's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly and took Little Hawk from Chaska's arms, cradling the boy with surprising gentleness for someone whose hands were calloused from stringing bows and skinning game. Two Moons moved to shield them with his horse, positioning himself between the group and the northern approach, his rifle across his lap. Chaska stepped closer to Eliza, close enough that she could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "We crossed together," he said, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "You guide us through the channels. I protect you from what follows. When we reach Black Butte, we find the doctor, and then—" He paused, his gaze steady and penetrating. "Then you decide. Stay with your railroad man and his promises, or ride with us." Eliza's breath caught. "I don't belong with your people. I'm white, You don't belong with them either," Chaska interrupted quietly. "I see it in your eyes. You're trapped between two worlds, and neither one feels like home. I know that feeling." There was something raw in his voice, a vulnerability that surprised her. Before she could respond, he reached out and took her hands, turning them palm up. The burns were raw, and weeping dirt crusted along the edges where she'd gripped the rope. His face darkened with what might have been anger or concern, she couldn't tell which. "This is from the rope. From saving Little Hawk." "It's nothing," she said, trying to pull away, but his grip was firm without being painful. "It's not nothing." He released her hands and moved to his saddlebags, rummaging briefly before pulling out a small leather pouch. Inside was a paste made from willow bark and bear grease, the scent sharp and medicinal. He scooped some onto his fingers and, without asking permission, took her right hand and began to spread the salve over her burns with careful, deliberate movements. The touch was clinical at first, efficient and practical, but as he worked, his movements slowed. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, lingering over the pulse point where her heartbeat hammered visibly beneath the skin. Eliza's breath hitched audibly. The wind gusted, carrying the scent of rain and sage and the distant smoke from Black Butte. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. His calloused fingers on her skin, the warmth of his body close to hers, the unspoken weight of what they'd survived and what still lay ahead. "Thank you," she whispered, surprised by the thickness in her voice. Chaska's eyes lifted to meet hers, and she saw something shift in their depths, a recognition perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the thread being woven between them. "You'll need these hands strong," he said quietly. "We're not done yet. Not by half." A sharp whistle cut through the air, two short bursts. Red Wren, now positioned atop a low rise, gestured urgently toward the north. "Riders coming fast, maybe 3 minutes out." Chaska's expression hardened instantly, The brief moment of intimacy shuddered behind the warrior's mask. He released her hand and moved to his horse, checking the straps on the gold small strong boxes with quick, efficient movements, ensuring they were secure. "We move now. Stay close to me." They plunged into the willow thicket, the horses splashing through shallow channels where the water ran cold and swift. The current tugged at Eliza's skirts, threatening to pull her off balance. And more than once she stumbled on the slick stones hidden beneath the muddy water. Each time Chaska's hand was there, gripping her elbow, steadying her, his body a bulwark against the river's pull. His touch was firm and sure, and she found herself leaning into his strength without shame. Little Hawk, wrapped securely in Red Wren's arms, coughed weakly. The sound drove them forward faster, pushing the horses through branches that whipped at their faces and arms, crashing through deadfall, until they reached what should have been the gravel bar Eliza had marked on her map a month ago. But the bar was gone, washed away, or submerged beneath 3 feet of rushing brown water that churned with dangerous currents and hidden debris. Eliza's heart sank like a stone. "Blast!" She breathed the mild curse, inadequate for the surge of fear. Chaska scanned the river with the intensity of a hawk, his jaw tight. Upstream, perhaps 200 yards distant, a massive cottonwood had been undermined by the relentless flood, its thick roots tearing free from the bank in long fibrous strands. The tree tilted at a precarious angle, groaning audibly even over the wind. As they watched, frozen in dread, the tree gave way with a thunderous crack that echoed across the basin. It toppled into the river like a falling giant, and the impact sent a surge of water roaring downstream toward them, a wall of brown foam and debris that would hit them in seconds. "Move!" Chaska shouted, his voice cutting through her paralysis. He grabbed Eliza and physically lifted her onto his horse, his strength startling, and then swung up behind her in one smooth motion, pulling her tight against his chest. His arms locked around her, one hand gripping the reins, the other braced across her ribs, holding her secure. Little Hawk was clutched in Red Wren's arms ahead of them. 2 Moons spurred his horse forward, and they all plunged into the current just as the wave struck. The world became chaos water noise, the desperate scramble of hooves on slick stone. Eliza's hands clung white-knuckled to the saddle horn as the horse fought to keep its footing, the current trying to sweep them sideways into deeper water. Chaska's arms were iron bands around her, holding her in place with unshakable determination, his breath hot and rapid against her ear. She felt every movement of his body as he shifted his weight to help the horse balance, felt the power in his thighs as he gripped the animal's sides. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice rough with exertion, and she did, her body pressed back against his with complete trust. The horse lunged its front hooves, finding purchase on a submerged rock. Then its back legs drove them forward with massive power. They surged across the channel, the current battering them mercilessly, and then finally, the bank. Solid ground. The horse lunged up the slope sides, heaving, and they were free, dripping and gasping, but alive. Red Wren's horse stumbled as it reached the bank, and Little Hawk's grip slipped from around the hunter's waist. The boy cried out weakly, his small body sliding sideways. Chaska was off his horse before Eliza could blink, wading back into the shallows with reckless speed to catch his son before the current could claim him. He lifted the boy, water streaming from his buckskin shirt and leggings, and pressed one hand to Little Hawk's forehead, his face going tight with fear. "He's burning up," Chaska said, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "Fever's taking hold." Eliza slid from the horse, her legs trembling, and moved to his side without hesitation. She placed her own hand on the boy's forehead, scalding hot despite the cold water soaking them all. "Then we get him to Merritt. Now, before the fever climbs higher." Chaska met her eyes, and in that moment a pact was forged, not in words, but in the shared desperation to save a life. in the recognition that they needed each other. He nodded decisive, and together they turned toward the distant smudge of Black Butte on the horizon, where smoke rose from cook fires, and a doctor waited who might save a boy's life. Behind them, the river roared its fury, and somewhere in the willow thickets, Sheriff Briggs and his deputies searched for blood and gold, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. Black Butte squatted on the prairie like something wounded and defiant, its buildings weathered gray by wind and sun and the relentless passage of hard years. The main street was a ribbon of churned mud, rutted deep by wagon wheels and hooves lined on both sides, by false-fronted structures that pretended to be grander than they were. Cora Bell's Mercantile, with its faded sign, the Lucky Draw Saloon, with its warped boardwalk, the telegraph office with its glass windows actually intact. And at the far end, the modest clapboard building that served as Dr. James Merritt's clinic, identifiable by the A plain medical shingle reading surgery on its door. The town held maybe 200 souls, most of them laborers for the Union Pacific, or homesteaders trying to scratch impossible livings from the hard ground, and their faces lined with the same weariness that marked the land itself. Full night had fallen by the time they rode in the street, lit by scattered oil lamps that cast pools of yellow light into the darkness. Chaska kept to the shadows between buildings, his horse moving at a silent walk, every sense alert for danger. Little Hawk lay slumped in Eliza's arms, his breathing shallow but steady, each breath a continued mercy. Red Wren and Two Moons flanked them, and their rifles hidden beneath blankets, but ready for immediate use, their eyes constantly scanning. Dr. Merritt's clinic showed dark from the street, but a faint glow leaked through the shutters of the back room, someone working late or unable to sleep. Chaska reined in behind the building, dismounting in silence, then helped Eliza down. She clutched Little Hawk her arms, aching from the long ride, every muscle protesting, and followed Chaska to the back door that led to Merritt's private quarters. Chaska knocked once, twice, 3 times, a specific rhythm deliberate and measured. A code, Eliza realized. The door opened a crack, and a face peered out, an older man, perhaps 60, gray-haired and bearded, with sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Dr. James Merritt. His eyes widened when he saw Chaska, then flicked to Eliza and the boy in her arms, and his expression shifted from surprise to concern to something Eliza couldn't quite read. Resignation mixed with something darker. Blast. Merritt muttered, his voice carrying a cultured Eastern accent at odds with the rough town. You bring trouble, friend. More than you know. I bring a boy who needs help. Chaska said quietly, his voice steady but with an edge of desperation beneath. Will you turn us away? Merritt hesitated longer than Eliza expected, his gaze moving between them with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Then he shook his head with a heavy sigh and opened the door wider. Get inside, quickly. They crowded into the back room, a cramped space that served as both surgery and living quarters. A narrow cot stood against one wall, a washstand beside it, and shelves lined with bottles and medical instruments covered another wall. A small desk buried in papers occupied one corner. The air smelled of carbolic acid old coffee and the musty scent of medical texts. A single oil lamp burned on the desk, casting dancing shadows. But Eliza noticed something new, a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame on the desk, showing a young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. The frame was surrounded by wilted flowers, clearly tended regularly, despite their age. Merritt gestured to the cot with practiced efficiency. Lay him down, carefully. Eliza placed Little Hawk on the cot with infinite care, her arms trembling from exhaustion as she released the boy's weight. She stepped back, legs unsteady, and felt Chaska's hand steady her elbow briefly before he moved to stay close to his son, one hand resting protectively on Little Hawk's shoulder. Merritt moved with focused intensity, lighting a second lamp and hanging it from a hook on the ceiling for better light. He bent over the boy, checking his pulse at wrist and throat, pressing a stethoscope to his chest to listen to his lungs, peeling back his eyelids to check his pupils with practiced thoroughness. As he worked, Eliza noticed his hands trembling slightly, not from age or infirmity, but from some emotion held tightly in check. "Near drowning," Merritt said after a long moment, his voice clinical but strained. "And severe exposure. His lungs are inflamed, I can hear the crackle, but there's no water in them, which means you got him breathing in time. He's young and strong, those are advantages." He paused, his jaw tightening. "He'll recover, but he needs rest, continued warmth, clean water, and I'll need to monitor him for pneumonia over the next few days." He glanced at Chaska, and Eliza saw something bitter flash across his face. "You did well. Better than I did when it mattered." The last words were spoken so quietly, Eliza almost missed them. Chaska frowned slightly, but said only, "Thank you." Merritt straightened and turned to Eliza, his gaze sharp and assessing in a way that made her uncomfortable. "And you? You're Keating's informant, aren't you, Miss Eliza O'Rourke from Boston?" Eliza stiffened, her hands clenching at her sides. "I was. I'm not anymore." Merritt studied her for a long moment, those sharp blue eyes, missing nothing, and then nodded slowly. "Good. That man's poison dressed up in a clerk's coat." He moved to the washstand and poured water into a basin, then handed Eliza a clean cloth. "Clean yourself up. Those hand wounds need proper treatment." As Eliza began wiping the mud and grime from her face and hands, wincing as the fabric touched her burns, Merritt moved to his desk. He pulled out a sheaf of papers, some official-looking documents, others clearly notes in his own hand. His movements were jerky, agitated, not the calm efficiency she'd expected from a doctor. "I've been tracking Keating and Briggs for years," Merritt said, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "Ever since my wife died." He touched the daguerreotype briefly, a gesture so tender it made Eliza's throat tighten. "Consumption took her 8 years ago this winter. She was only 32. I could have saved her. There were new medicines coming from the East treatments that showed real promise. But they cost money. More money than a frontier doctor makes in 5 years. His hand clenched into a fist. The treaty gold that came through 6 years ago, the shipment Keating and Briggs stole. That gold was supposed to fund medical supplies for the territory, including medicines for the civilian population. If it had reached its proper destination, I could have purchased what I needed. My wife would still be alive." The room had gone silent. Even Two Moons and Red Wren, standing by the door and understanding only some of the English, seemed to sense the weight of what was being said. "I'm sorry for your loss," Chaska said quietly, sincerity in every word. "Are you—" Merritt's voice sharpened. "Your people raided settlements, burned homesteads. How many wives and children died in those raids? We defended our land from those who would take it." Chaska replied, his voice level, but his eyes hardening. "And we did not steal gold meant to save lives." Merritt's face worked, emotions warring across it. No, you're right. The blame lies with Keating and Briggs. They're the ones who deserve justice." He spread several papers on the desk. "These are telegraph records I've been collecting. The night operator copies them for me. I saved his daughter's life 3 years ago, and he's been in my debt ever since. These messages show Keating coordinating with Briggs to intercept tribal shipments and divert funds. And these," he tapped another set of documents, "are assay records. The gold bars you recovered this morning bear the same marks as the treaty shipment from 6 years ago. The evidence is damning." Eliza moved closer to examine the papers, her trained eye picking out the details. Everything Merritt said appeared true. The assay marks matched the dates aligned, the paper trail was clear. "This could convict them both," she said. "It could," Merritt agreed. "If it reaches the right people. The territorial judge, perhaps, or the federal marshal in Cheyenne." He paused, his eyes distant. "But Keating is clever. He'll destroy evidence, bribe witnesses, disappear if he feels threatened. And Briggs is a rabid dog who needs to be put down before he kills again." Something in Merritt's tone made Eliza's instincts prickle with unease. But before she could examine the feeling, the door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. A small, wiry woman in her late 30s, rushed in brown hair, pinned in a severe bun, sharp eyes, wide with urgency. Her calico dress was mud-stained at the hem, and she carried a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Ada Finch, the town's schoolmarm. "James," she gasped, breathless. "They have him. Keating's men took Liam O'Rourke this afternoon." The world tilted beneath Eliza's feet. "What?" Ada turned to her, pity and determination warring in her expression. "I saw it happen around 3 o'clock. Pike and 2 railroad men, I didn't recognize them, dragging a young man from the freight wagon on the East Road. He was fighting them, shouting that he was innocent. I heard Pike say his name clear as day, Liam O'Rourke. They gagged him, tied him, and took him toward the old rail trestle over Copper Gorge." Eliza's legs gave out, and she sank onto the edge of the cot beside little Hawk's sleeping form. "No. Oh God, no." Chaska was at her side immediately, his hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding. "Why?" he demanded, his voice hard as granite. "Why take her brother now?" Ada pulled a crumpled paper from her satchel, a torn receipt stained with ink. "Because Keating never intended to honor his agreement. Tom Bailey and I broke into Keating's office last night. Tom couldn't take the guilt anymore. He's been paying protection money to Briggs for 2 years, and his conscience finally won. We picked the lock, and I found this." She held up the receipt. "It's a ledger entry dated 6 months ago listing Liam O'Rourke as collateral for services rendered. Keating's been using Liam as a hostage from the start to ensure your cooperation and silence." The room spun. Eliza stared at the receipt, forcing herself to focus through the tears blurring her vision. Liam O'Rourke. Collateral. Disposal upon completion or defection. The brutal truth that Keating had never planned to free Liam, that her brother's life had been forfeit from the moment she'd agreed to spy, hit her like a physical blow. She'd been a fool so desperate to save Liam that she'd walked into a trap without seeing it. "He used me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Played me like a puppet." "He used your love against you," Chaska said firmly, his hand tightening on her shoulder. "That's not weakness. That's being human." Ada continued, her voice urgent. "There's worse. Pike was bragging to one of the other men, thinking no one could hear. He said Keating's planning an exchange at Dawn the Gold for Liam. But Keating doesn't intend to let anyone walk away. He'll kill them all and stage it to look like a failed ambush, blame it on hostile Indians, and use the incident to justify harsher measures against the tribes." Merritt had been silent through Ada's revelations, his face unreadable. Now he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Then we need a plan. The trestle is 4 miles east across rough ground. If we're going to confront them, we need to be smart about it." Something in his tone made Eliza look at him sharply, her instincts screaming warning. But Chaska was already moving to the desk, studying the rough map Merritt had sketched of the area. "We'll need to position people carefully. 2 moons and red wren in the willows for covering fire. I'll approach with the gold." "You're injured," Eliza interrupted, noticing for the first time the way Chaska favored his left side, the stiffness in his movements. "When did that happen?" During the river crossing, Chaska admitted. A submerged branch caught my ribs. It's nothing serious, but it will slow me down in a fight. Then we do this together, Eliza said, standing on shaking legs, fury and determination burning away the fear. Keating wants me fine. I'll give him exactly what he deserves. They bent over the map, planning an earnest approach, routes, contingency signals. Ada took notes, her hand steady despite the danger. But Eliza noticed Merritt watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read, satisfaction mixed with something that looked almost like guilt. The feeling of unease grew stronger, settling in her gut like a cold stone, but she pushed it aside. They had until dawn, and her brother's life hung in the balance. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, Keating waited with her brother's life in his cold, calculating hands. And somewhere in this room, Eliza was beginning to suspect a secret waited that would change everything. But first they needed the gold. Without it, they had no leverage, nothing to trade. The plan required at least 1 crate of treaty gold to use as bait for the exchange. Merritt had suggested they retrieve it under cover of darkness, before Briggs could mount an organized search. Dead Crow's Hollow looked even more menacing under the 3/4 moon, and the collapsed tunnel mouth a gaping wound in the earth that seemed to exhale cold, damp air. They'd left Little Hawk in Ada's care. The school marm had moved him to her boarding house, where she could watch over him more discreetly than at the clinic. Merritt had stayed behind, claiming his presence would be missed if anyone came looking for medical help. But he'd provided them with a detailed description of where the gold small strongboxes were hidden in the side shaft. Chaska reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning every shadow. The moonlight made everything look alien, transforming familiar shapes into threatening silhouettes. Beside him, Eliza sat rigid in the saddle, her mind churning with fear for Liam and growing suspicion about Merritt. Something about the doctor's behavior had felt off, the way he'd watched them plan, the bitterness in his voice when he'd spoken of his wife's death, the too detailed knowledge of Briggs's movements. "There," Chaska said quietly, pointing toward the stand of willows near the riverbank. "The side shaft. If the collapse spared it, the gold should still be accessible." 2 Moons and Red Wren remained with the horses concealed in the cottonwoods, their rifles ready. Chaska pulled a coil of rope from his saddle and slung it over his shoulder, wincing slightly at the movement. His ribs were definitely injured. Eliza could see it in the careful way he breathed the stiffness when he turned. They approached the tunnel cautiously. The main entrance was completely blocked by fallen timbers and stone, but the side shaft, carved into the bank about 15 feet higher, appeared intact. Chaska began to climb the rubble slope, testing each foothold. Eliza followed with the lantern, her heart pounding with exertion and apprehension. They reached the shaft entrance and squeezed through, ducking beneath the low ceiling. Inside, the air was damp and close, smelling of earth and decay. The lantern light flickered over the walls, and there, just as Merritt had described, was the crate covered with a torn tarp. "Still here," Chaska said with relief, moving toward it. Then the voice cut through the darkness, harsh and triumphant. "Thought you'd come sniffing back for it eventually." Sheriff Dan Briggs stepped from the shadows deeper in the shaft, a revolver in one hand and a lantern in the other. Behind him emerged Pike and another man Eliza didn't recognize, both armed. Briggs's face was flushed with whiskey and rage, his eyes bloodshot but alert enough to be dangerous. "How?" Chaska started, his hand moving toward his rifle. "Did we know?" Briggs laughed, ugly and mean. "Your doctor friend sent word. Real helpful of him, telling us exactly when and where you'd be." He raised the revolver, aiming at Chaska's chest. "He wanted us to take you alive if possible, but I ain't that patient. You cost me a deputy today, Redskin. Time to settle accounts." The betrayal hit Eliza like a physical blow. Merit. The doctor had set them up, had sent them into this trap. But why? The question burned, even as fear flooded her veins. Chaska moved with startling speed, despite his injury, diving sideways as Briggs fired. The shot went wide, ricocheting off stone with a whine that made Eliza's ears ring. She dropped the lantern instinctively, and it shattered, spilling oil that ignited with a whoosh, throwing wild shadows across the shaft. "Eliza, run!" Chaska shouted, but she couldn't run, wouldn't leave him. She pulled the revolver Chaska had given her earlier, her hand steady despite the terror, and fired at Pike. The deputy yelped and dove for cover as her bullet struck the wall near his head. The confined space made every sound deafening, the smoke from the gunfire choking. Chaska had closed the distance with Briggs, using the momentary distraction to charge. The two men collided with brutal force, crashing into the shaft wall. Briggs was heavier, stronger, and fueled by alcohol-driven rage. He drove his knee into Chaska's injured ribs, and the warrior gasped, his grip loosening. Pike recovered and lunged for Eliza. She swung the revolver toward him, but he was faster, catching her wrist and twisting viciously. Pain shot up her arm, and the gun fell from her grip. Pike's fist caught her in the stomach, driving the air from her lungs, and she doubled over, gasping. The third man had drawn a knife and was circling toward Chaska's back, clearly intending to finish him, while Briggs held him. Eliza, fighting for breath, saw the danger and screamed a warning. Chaska twisted at the last second, taking the knife across his left shoulder instead of his spine. Blood bloomed dark on his buckskin shirt, but he managed to throw Briggs off and pivot to face the new threat. The fight became chaos. Chaska, wounded and outnumbered, fought with desperate skill, but he was weakening. Eliza scrambled for her fallen revolver, Pike grabbing at her legs. She kicked him in the face with her boot heel, felt the satisfying crunch of cartilage, and his grip loosened. She grabbed the revolver and fired not at Pike, but at the already damaged support timber nearest the entrance. The shaft shook violently. More timbers cracked under the stress. Pike's eyes widened with sudden fear. "The whole thing's coming down!" Briggs swore viciously and shoved Chaska away, turning to run. The man with the knife followed, scrambling toward the entrance. Pike hesitated, his face bloodied and furious, then fled after them. "Move!" Chaska grabbed Eliza's arm, and they ran deeper into the shaft, instead of toward the collapsing entrance, a counterintuitive choice, but the only one available. Behind them, the entrance collapsed entirely, with a roar of falling rock and splintering wood sealing them in darkness, lit only by the flames from the spilled lamp oil. They reached the back of the shaft, where Eliza remembered the map showing a possible connection to the lower flooded tunnels. Chaska was bleeding heavily now, his face pale in the firelight, but his hands were steady as he searched the wall. "Here a gap. Can you fit through?" "What about the gold?" Eliza gasped. "Forget the gold," Chaska said through gritted teeth. "We need to survive first." He shoved the crate toward the edge of the shaft, where it dropped into darkness, the flooded lower tunnel. The crate teetered, then fell with a distant splash. At least Briggs wouldn't have it. The fire was spreading, consuming the old dry timbers, and smoke filled the shaft. Chaska pushed Eliza toward the gap in the wall. "Go, I'm right behind you." She squeezed through the narrow opening, feeling stones scrape her arms and back, then tumbled into a lower chamber where ankle-deep water covered the floor. A moment later, Chaska came through barely fitting, and they splashed through the flooded passage toward a faint gray light ahead, moonlight showing where the old workings opened onto the riverbank. They emerged, gasping into the night air, collapsing on the muddy bank, just as the entire structure of Dead Crow's Hollow groaned and collapsed behind them, flames shooting up into the darkness. Two Moons and Red Wren found them minutes later, helped them onto the horses. Chaska was barely conscious, his shoulder bleeding steadily. Eliza felt battered and bruised, but alive. As they rode away from the burning ruin, her mind worked furiously. Merritt had betrayed them. But why to get revenge on Keating and Briggs by orchestrating a confrontation to ensure they destroyed each other? The pieces didn't quite fit, but one thing was clear: they couldn't trust the doctor anymore. They were on their own, wounded with no gold and dawn approaching fast. And Liam was still captive, his life measured in hours. The rail trestle loomed against the pre-dawn sky like a skeletal monument to ambition and decay, dark timbers and rusted iron spanning Copper Gorge in a framework that swayed visibly in the wind. The gorge itself was a brutal gash in the earth, over 100 feet deep, where the river churned brown and violent with recent floods. The water had risen significantly overnight, fed by upstream runoff, and now it roared like a living thing, hungry for victims. Chaska sat on his horse beside Eliza in the concealing darkness of a pine stand, his left shoulder wrapped in makeshift bandages torn from her chemise blood, seeping through despite her best efforts. His face was drawn with pain and blood loss, his movements careful and precise to avoid aggravating the knife wound. He was in no condition to fight, but there was no other choice. Dawn was minutes away, and they had no gold, no backup they could trust, and no plan except desperation. On the trestle's center span stood Paymaster Keating, his dark coat and derby hat, unmistakable even in the gray light. Beside him was Briggs, his face bandaged where Pike's broken nose had bled on him during their escape from the mine. And there, tied to a support beam, was Liam, head hanging, face bruised, but alive. "We don't have the gold," Eliza whispered, her voice tight with despair. "What do we trade?" "We trade truth," Chaska said quietly. "And we make them afraid." Before she could ask what he meant, a voice spoke from the darkness behind them. "You'll need more than truth." Eliza spun, her revolver raised, to find Dr. Merritt emerging from the trees on foot, leading his horse. In his hands, he carried a corner-reinforced small strong boxes, one of the gold small strong boxes. Her breath caught. "You," she hissed, fury and confusion warring. "You betrayed us to Briggs." "No." Merritt said, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret or determination, she couldn't tell which. "I told Briggs where you'd be, yes, but not to help him." He set the crate down carefully. "I needed you all in the same place. Keating, Briggs, you, the gold, all the pieces of the puzzle that destroyed my life. I've spent 8 years planning this, collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment. You recovering the gold triggered it. I knew Briggs would chase you, knew you'd need the gold for the exchange, knew I could orchestrate a confrontation where the truth would finally come out." "You used us," Chaska said, his voice dangerous despite his weakness. "We could have died in that mine. I gambled that you wouldn't," Merritt said, meeting his eyes. "You're a survivor, Chaska. I've known that since the blizzard. And Miss O'Rourke is clever and resourceful. I believed you'd escape. I retrieved this crate from the flooded lower tunnel after you left. I knew the mine's layout from the original surveys. I've been planning this for years." "Planning what?" Eliza demanded. "Revenge, justice," Merritt corrected, and his voice carried a weight of pain that made her throat tighten. "Justice for my wife, for every person Keating and Briggs have harmed. This gold is the key to convicting them, both physical evidence they can't deny or destroy. But it only works if we bring it to them at the moment of their greatest crime, with witnesses present." He pulled a bundle of papers from his coat. "I've arranged for the territorial judge's clerk to arrive at the trestle at dawn, along with 2 soldiers from Fort Laramie. They're waiting a quarter-mile east, ready to observe and intervene." Eliza's mind reeled. "You're insane. This could all go wrong." "It already has," Merritt said grimly. "But we work with what we have. I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm offering you a chance to save your brother and destroy Keating at the same time. But we have to do it now." Chaska and Eliza exchanged a long look. They had no reason to trust this man who'd manipulated them, endangered them, used them as pieces in his long game of vengeance. But they also had no other options, and Liam's life was slipping away with every passing second. "Together, then," Chaska said finally. "But if you betray us again, I'll kill you myself." Merritt nodded, accepting the threat without flinching. "Fair enough." They rode onto the trestle together, Merritt with the gold crate Chaska and Eliza flanking him, 2 moons and Red Wren hanging back as planned. The wooden planks groaned under the horse's weight, and the structure swayed sickeningly. Eliza forced herself not to look down through the gaps at the roaring water far below. Keating watched them approach with cold calculation. Briggs straightened his hand, moving to his revolver. As they drew within speaking distance, Keating's gaze fixed on Merritt with narrowed eyes. "Doctor," he said, his voice carrying that flat ledger-keeper precision. An unexpected addition to the proceedings. "I'm here to see justice done." Merritt said, his voice steady. "Justice?" Briggs laughed mean and whiskey rough. "You're here because you're a fool who can't let go of the past. Your wife was weak, Merritt. Consumption takes the weak. That's nature." Merritt's face went white, then red with fury. "She died because you and Keating stole money meant for medicine. She died because of your greed." "Prove it," Keating said, unruffled. "You have no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but the ravings of a grief-mad old man." "I have the gold," Merritt said, gesturing to the crate, "with assay marks that match the stolen treaty shipment. I have telegraph records documenting your coordination with Briggs. I have ledger entries in your own hand, and I have witnesses prepared to testify." He raised his voice, projecting toward the eastern approach, including the territorial judge's representative who is watching right now. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Keating's face. Briggs swore viciously. "This is a trap." Keating said, his voice hardening. "Briggs, kill them all." Everything happened at once. Briggs drew his revolver and aimed at Merritt. Chaska, despite his injury, kicked his horse forward, putting himself between the doctor and the sheriff. The shot took him high in the chest, instead of Merritt's head, his 3rd wound of the night, and this one dropped him from the saddle. "No!" Eliza screamed, dismounting before the horse even stopped running to where Chaska had fallen on the swaying planks. Keating lunged for Liam, drawing a derringer from his coat and pressing it to the young man's temple. "Stop, all of you, or the boy dies." Eliza froze her hand on Chaska's chest, feeling his labored breathing, his blood hot and sticky on her fingers. His eyes met hers, and she saw pain and determination, and something else, a wordless apology for leaving her, for not being strong enough to see this through. "Don't you dare," she whispered to him. "Don't you dare die on me." Pike had appeared from the eastern end of the trestle, blocking the approach Merritt had claimed the judge's clerk would use. "Ain't no witnesses coming," Pike called out. "I sent them off with a story about rabid Indians attacking the depot. We got all the time we need." Merritt's face fell, his plan collapsing. He looked at Eliza with something like desperation. "I'm sorry. You thought wrong," Eliza said, her voice cold and hard. She stood slowly, leaving Chaska gasping on the planks, and turned to face Keating. The paymaster still held his derringer to Liam's head, and her brother's eyes were wide with terror, but also trust that his sister would save him somehow. She had no gold to trade. She had no allies coming. She had a wounded warrior bleeding out on the trestle behind her, a brother hostage, and enemies on all sides. But she had her mind and her hands, and a fury that burned brighter than fear. "You want the gold," she said to Keating. "It's in the crate. But I'm the only one who can verify the assay marks, who can confirm it's genuine. Kill Liam and you get nothing. You have to let me check it first." Keating's eyes narrowed, calculating. "Check it then, but quickly." Eliza moved to the crate, her mind racing. She could see movement at the eastern approach, not the judge's clerk, but more of Briggs's men moving into position. They were surrounded, outgunned, doomed, unless she could change the equation somehow. Then she saw it beneath the trestle's center span, barely visible, a black powder keg nestled among the support beams, with a fuse leading back toward where Briggs stood. The sheriff had planned to blow the trestle all along, had set this up as a death trap for everyone. A plan formed desperate and dangerous, but their only chance. She opened the crate, making a show of examining the gold bars, and as she did, she positioned herself so her body blocked Keating's view of her other hand. She pulled the small knife she kept in her boot and palmed it, then turned back to Keating. "It's genuine," she said, "but you'll never spend it." She threw the knife not at Keating, but at the taut rope holding Liam to the post. The blade struck true, severing the rope. Liam lunged sideways away from Keating's derringer, and Eliza was already moving, diving toward the crate and tipping it over the side of the trestle. Gold bars tumbled into the gorge, glinting in the first rays of dawn, before disappearing into the churning water below. "No!" Keating screamed, lunging after the gold in pure reflex. And that moment of distraction was all Liam needed. He brought his bound hands up and drove them into Keating's jaw, sending the paymaster stumbling back. Briggs roared in fury and lit the fuse to the powder keg. "If I can't have the gold, nobody gets nothing." The fuse hissed to life, sparking toward the keg. Merritt, seeing what was happening, ran toward it with desperate speed, but Pike tackled him, driving the doctor to the planks. Eliza ran to Liam, sawing at the ropes, binding his wrists with frantic haste. The fuse was burning down fast, 20 seconds, maybe less. Behind her, Chaska had somehow dragged himself upright, using the railing for support. His face was gray with blood loss, but his eyes were clear. He raised his rifle one-handed, bracing it against the rail, and fired. The shot struck Briggs in the leg, and the sheriff went down howling. 15 seconds. Liam's ropes parted, and Eliza shoved him toward the eastern approach. "Run! Get clear!" "Not without you." Liam grabbed her arm. 10 seconds. 2 Moons and Red Wren had appeared from their hiding places, firing at Pike and the other deputies, creating chaos and confusion. Merritt broke free from Pike's grip and lunged toward the keg, reaching for the fuse. 5 seconds. The trestle groaned ominously, the rising river having weakened the support pylons. Eliza felt the structure shift beneath her feet. If the powder keg didn't kill them, the collapse would. She made a choice in that instant, perhaps the hardest choice of her life. She couldn't save everyone, but she could save the ones who mattered most. She ran to Chaska, threw his arm over her shoulders, and with strength born of pure desperation, dragged him toward the western approach where their horses waited. Liam helped taking Chaska's other side, and together they moved with agonizing slowness. Merritt reached the keg. His hands closed around the fuse, still burning inches from the powder. He yanked with all his strength, and the fuse pulled free. He threw it over the side, and Eliza saw it fall spiraling down into the water, extinguishing with a hiss. The powder keg didn't explode, but the trestle, weakened and overloaded, chose that moment to give way. The center span collapsed with a thunderous groan of breaking timber and shrieking metal. Keating, still scrambling after his lost gold, plunged into the gorge with a scream that cut off abruptly when he hit the water. Briggs tried to crawl to safety, but the planks gave way beneath him, and he too fell, his heavy body disappearing into the churning brown chaos. Pike ran, but not fast enough. The collapse caught him, and he vanished in the wreckage. Merritt, standing on the failing center span, looked at Eliza across the growing gap. Their eyes met. She saw regret there, and acceptance, and something that might have been peace. "Tell them," Merritt shouted over the roar of collapsing wood. "Tell them the truth about what they did." Then the section he stood on gave way entirely, and Dr. James Merritt fell with it, disappearing into the gorge below. Eliza, Chaska, and Liam reached solid ground just as the western end of the trestle began to collapse. They stumbled clear, falling to their knees on the grass, gasping and shaking. 2 Moons and Red Wren had made it out as well, their faces grim but alive. Behind them, the trestle finished its death throes, the entire structure collapsing into Copper Gorge with a finality that sounded like the end of the world. Dust and spray rose into the dawn air, and then gradually silence fell, except for the river's endless roar. They stayed there, all of them, catching their breath, checking for injuries, letting the reality of survival sink in. Chaska's wounds were serious, but not immediately fatal. Eliza packed them with strips torn from her clothes, her hands steady despite the trembling that had started in her core. "Is he dead?" Liam asked hoarsely, staring at the wreckage where Keating had fallen. "Are they all dead?" "I don't know," Eliza said honestly. The river was brutal, the fall long, the debris deadly. Even if some had survived the initial plunge, the current would have carried them away. But it's over. They have no gold, no power, and if they survived, they're finished. Chaska's hand found hers squeezed weakly. "You saved us," he murmured. "All of us." "We saved each other," Eliza corrected, her voice breaking. She looked at the ruins of the trestle at the place where Merritt had fallen. The doctor's final act had been redemption, saving them all, by pulling the fuse even at the cost of his own life. His 8-year quest for justice had ended in a grave at the bottom of Copper Gorge. But perhaps he'd finally found what he was looking for. We all did what we had to do. The sun broke over the horizon, flooding the prairie with golden light, and Eliza felt the weight of the long night begin to lift. They were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. And now finally, they could begin to heal. 3 weeks later, the territorial judge arrived in Black Butte with a company of soldiers. The wreckage of the trestle was explored, and bodies were recovered. Keating's was found a mile downstream, broken beyond recognition, but identified by his clothes and the papers in his coat. Briggs was never found, presumably washed away or buried in the gorge. Pike's body was recovered from the debris. The evidence Merritt had collected was presented to the judge. Telegraph records, ledger entries, assay marks on gold bars recovered from the flooded tunnels at Dead Crow's Hollow by a recovery team. Ada testified. Tom Bailey testified. Even Cora Bell from the Mercantile testified about the intimidation and bribes she'd witnessed over the years. The verdict was unanimous. Keating and Briggs had been guilty of embezzlement, theft, conspiracy, and murder. Their deaths were ruled the result of their own criminal actions. The treaty gold that remained was divided according to Chaska's wishes, part to his band, part to fund a clinic in Merritt's name, part to repair infrastructure and settle debts. Liam's charges were formally dropped, his name cleared. He chose to stay in Black Butte, working with Tom Bailey and learning to farm, finding purpose in building rather than running. Chaska recovered slowly, his wounds healing under Ada's careful nursing. The knife wound in his shoulder left a scar that would never fully fade, and his ribs ached in cold weather. But he was alive. Little Hawk thrived, his near drowning a fading memory replaced by new experiences and the joy of having Eliza as a part of his life. 6 months after the trestle collapsed on a spring morning when the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, Eliza O'Rourke and Chaska were married in both Lakota tradition and territorial law. The ceremony was small but joyful. 2 Moons and Red Wren stood witness, Ada wept openly. Tom Bailey smiled his quiet satisfaction, and Little Hawk grinned so wide his face might have split. The reception was held in the new community meeting hall, the first structure funded by the recovered gold where both white settlers and Lakota families gathered to celebrate. It wasn't perfect. Old tensions hadn't vanished. But it was a beginning, a foundation, a choice to build rather than destroy. As evening fell and the dancing began, Chaska and Eliza slipped away to the porch where they could watch the celebration, but have a moment of quiet. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, careful of his healing shoulder, and she leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft in her ear. "Yes," she said simply. "More than I ever thought possible." No regrets. She thought of Boston and its cobblestones, of the life she'd left behind, of the desperate 6 months she'd spent as Keating's unwilling spy. She thought of Dr. Merritt, whose quest for justice had been twisted by grief but had ultimately saved them all. She thought of the long night on the trestle of the choices made in fire and blood and desperation. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Every step brought me here. To you. To this life we're building." Chaska pressed a kiss to her temple. "You saved my son, and in doing so you saved me. I owe you more than gold." Eliza finished turning in his arms to face him. "I know, but you don't owe me anything. We're partners, equals. We save each other. That's how this works." Chaska smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Tied, then. Not even, but tied." Tied. Eliza agreed and kissed him as the stars emerged overhead, cold and brilliant and infinite. Behind them, the party continued, laughter and music, carrying across the valley children of both communities, playing together, old boundaries slowly dissolving. Ahead of them lay challenges and difficulties, the ongoing work of building trust between communities that had been at war. But they would face those challenges together with the strength that came from having survived the worst and chosen each other in the aftermath. And on a small hill overlooking Black Butte, a simple marker had been placed, a wooden cross bearing the name James Merritt, beloved husband and healer, who had sought justice and found redemption. Eliza visited it sometimes, leaving wildflowers and saying quiet words of thanks to the complicated man who had saved them all, even at the cost of his own life. The wind whispered across the prairie, carrying the scent of sage and new grass, and Eliza thought she could almost hear Merritt's voice on it. Tell them the truth. And she had. She would continue to tell it, ensuring that the sacrifices made and the lessons learned would not be forgotten. The story of a woman who saved a boy from drowning, of a warrior who owed her more than gold, of a doctor who chose justice over revenge. At the final moment that story would endure, told around fires and dinner tables, a reminder that even in the hardest times, redemption was possible. And love, practical, hard-won, earned through survival, was the strongest foundation of all.